Hey there, my name is Jeff Alexander, and I'm the pastor here at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. In a few moments, we're going to be talking about God's faithfulness in revitalizing or renewing our lives and our church. Which reminds me that if you ever wanted to stop by and visit Pleasant Hill on a Sunday morning, we would love to have you stop by. Every Sunday morning, we meet at 10 o'clock at 80 Pleasant Hill Road here in Hollis. Just come up to the top of Pleasant Hill Road, and we are the church building that's on the left-hand side as you're coming up the hill from 117. But would love to have a chance just to meet you, for you get a chance to meet with us, not just me, but the congregation that is here, and develop a fellowship and a friendship with them as well. If you have any questions as you're listening to this message or before you come and visit with us, you can shoot me an email. You can send me a message on Facebook. You can put a comment in the comment section here on this YouTube channel, and I'd love to dialogue with you about Pleasant Hill, about the topic that we're talking about today, about revitalization. We've been talking about it for a couple of weeks, and we're going to continue talking about that topic of revitalization. You know, if you've ever spent any time with me, if you've ever connected with me, you would know that I am a Cleveland sports fan. Through and through. I'm a dedicated Cleveland sports fan. There's a couple of times that I've been tempted to jump to another team and cheer for another team, but I've always stuck with, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Cleveland Browns, the Cleveland Indians. It seems to be, it's kind of funny, one of the websites that I kind of frequent when I'm looking at Cleveland Brown news is the Factory of Sadness, because that's kind of the Cleveland sports mindset, is that it's a constant, perpetual losing team. So this year, the Browns have a 4-1 record, which is better than the New England Patriots, which I know many of you are New England Patriots fans, so I probably just turned many of you off. But my wife is a New England Patriots fan, and so I get a chance to let her know that at this point, the Cleveland Browns have a better record than the New England Patriots. First time since Bill Belichick coached them, way back when. Yes, Cleveland Browns were coached by Bill Belichick. That's the last time they had a 4-1 record. So there is a little bit of a New England tie there. But anyways, something else that I enjoy doing is backyard gardening. I've moved from the Midwest, and so it's a little bit different here in New England. I'm still trying to figure that out after summer number 2. Back in Iowa and Kansas, you can put seed in the ground, and it would just grow and grow and grow. Here, it's a little bit different. So I've got to figure out how to get a good produce that I can get a good produce out of the ground. And hey, send me some suggestions. I would love to hear them. But you would also know that I've taught math before. I've taught 10 years of high school math. Favorite subject in math is calculus. I loved it. And so if you need any help in math, hey, let me know. You'll also find out that when I was 19, 20 years old, I did some pretty stupid things, as many of you probably have done as well. That's kind of a time of learning and a time of growing. And so, when we're 18, 19, 20, we're kind of learning some things and trying to figure some things out. And some of us do some pretty stupid things. And you'd find out that I did some pretty stupid things. And if I sat down with you, I would probably learn some very similar things about you, about what it is that you are, who you are currently, and what you currently enjoy in life. A lot of times, those things come from previous experiences that we tend to hold on to. Those things that we continue to dwell on, we internalize, and so we take those past experiences and we see them playing out in our life today. For some of you, you may have had some disappointment in your life. You may have disappointed someone in life or been disappointed by someone in life. You may have had some broken dreams, some broken promises that you may have experienced in life. Some shattered dreams where you anticipated yourself being at the age of 20 or 25 or 40 or 45 or 60 or 65 or any of those age ranges in between that you thought, well, here's where I'm going to be at this point in my life, and didn't quite make it to what you expected. You may have elevated yourself to an unhealthy place, put a lot of pressure on yourself, caused a lot of stress in your life because you had these high expectations in your life, and you've put those expectations there for one reason or another, and you haven't in your mind, met up to those expectations? You know, these past experiences have a potential to keep us from seeing revitalization take place in our life. It's kind of like a washing machine on a continual spin cycle that just never seems to stop. We're just continue to being spun around and around and around and around and around. And we just feel like I'm stuck in a circle. I'm stuck here because of some of these things that I've experienced in the past. Let me assure you that God's faithfulness brings about revitalization in our lives. He's able to bring about that revitalization. You know, so far, we've talked about revitalization, and it seems like we've talked about how God is the one that does the revitalization in our life and in our church. And you think, well, is there anything for me to do? Is there anything that we can do to seek out revitalization, to be part of this revitalization process? Well, that's what we're going to look at today, because it's important for us to consider our past experiences. Because if we take our past experiences, they should inform our future, but they shouldn't define our future. And we're going to take a look at a group of people this morning in Ezra, where the nation of Israel had experienced a revitalization in their nation. And we're going to take a look at, I'm not going to read everything in verse or chapter 2, because it's a lot of genealogy. It's a lot of names. I just wanted to read a few portions. I'm not saying the names aren't important, but just for time's sake, I'm just going to read some of these portions of Scripture. And if you wanted to go back and read the entire chapter 2 on your own, you know, go ahead and do that. I've read through it a couple of times, and there's some names in there you might not be able to pronounce, but do your best at pronouncing those. But I just wanted to start out in chapter 2, verse 1, and read through this text here. It says, "Now these were the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of those exiles from Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried captive to Babylonia. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. They came with Zerubbabel," which is a fun name to say, at least I think it is, "Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvah, Rehum, and Bana. And then it goes into a whole bunch of names. You know, it kind of breaks it down. It says the number of the men of the people of Israel, so it kind of gives a section of these are the people that came out, these are the families that came out of Babylon. Then it goes on to the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, goes to the sons of the Solomon's servants, and it goes to this interesting group that we'll hopefully have time to talk about later, is those that could not prove their father's houses were of the descendants of Abraham. They didn't have a tie back to Abraham or to the nation of Israel. They couldn't produce the documentation. And then it says the whole assembly was 42,360, down in verse 64. It says, besides their male and female servants, so it talks about the servants they brought with them. It talks about the singers they brought with them. It talks about the animals they brought with them. These animals of burden that kind of helped do the work of revitalization, to carry the load for them. And then in verse 68, it says, some of the heads of the families, when they came to the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, made freewill offerings for the house of God, to erect it on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury of the work 61,000 derricks of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 1,000 priests' garments. Now the priests, the Levites, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants lived in their towns, and all the rest of Israel in their towns. And so we see this group of people that come out. Some scholars would say this is a summary of the nation of Israel. There are several different waves that came from Babylon to Jerusalem, and this is kind of a summary of those individuals. Others would say that it was just one group of people that came out at the very beginning. I tend to lean a little bit more towards this is a summary in some sorts of everyone that came back to Israel to do this revitalization. But we see a few things about revitalization here in the second chapter of Ezra, and you'd kind of think, how in the world can we get any type of message or any type of anything to learn out of a bunch of names, genealogy? Well, I think that there's a few things that we can draw out there that we can kind of add to our picture of revitalization as we're building this narrative of revitalization in our lives and in our church. I think one of the things that we can draw out is there's a revitalizing of leadership. You know, in Israel's history, there's this motif that runs through of these three types of leaders: prophet, priest, and king. These are characters that show up quite often in nation of Israel's history. You know, a prophet would be someone who is encouraging them to follow God or calls them back to God. We talked about Jeremiah last week, about how Jeremiah was a prophet to Judah, partially during the Babylonian captivity, the time leading up to the Babylonian captivity. But there's also other prophets throughout the nation of throughout the history of Israel that were calling them back to God or pointing them to God and encouraging them, exhorting them, we'll say, encouraging them to pursue God. But then we also have the priest, who provided a way to have intimacy with God, who was a mediator between the nation and between God, offered sacrifices, offered a place where they can come and worship. And that's what their responsibility was. And then we see the king, who demonstrates godly leadership and an example for them to follow. And these three individuals worked together to point the nation of Israel to God and to pursue God. But the thing was, during the Babylonian captivity, this kind of crumbled. And this was there were a lot of prophets that came through during the Babylonian captivity, but the king, the office of king and priest just kind of muddled through this Babylonian captivity. And there really was no need for a king because they were under someone else's rule. But here it is we see in verses 1 and 2, the leadership coming back to life in a sense, to being revitalized. You know, that it gives a list of them. In the first two characters, the first two names on that list, we see are two individuals that play a prominent role in rebuilding and bringing revitalization to the nation of Israel. Zerubbabel being the first one. And he was actually of the line of David, the king. Now, he wasn't instituted as the king. He wasn't put forth as the king. But he came that figure that was the leader that pointed and started living as an example. Now, he had his faults and his failures, and we'll take a look at those later on, not today, but later on in the series. But he pointed the nation of Israel back to God. And he lived in a way that encouraged them to pursue him. And then we see Jeshua, the second person on the list, who was of the priestly line, of the line of Aaron that started offering sacrifices. Now, these two characters, Zerubbabel and Jeshua, they're seen together throughout the book of Ezra as a revitalization of leadership, a group of people that were pointing those that were following them back to God. So we see a revitalizing of leadership, but we also see a revitalizing of a promise. You know, genealogies are important in the nation of to the nation of Israel, to Jews. Why are they important? Because it provides a tie back to Abraham. It provides that tie back to Abraham because of the promise that was given to him. If we look back at Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we'll see that promise. And there's two, you can say, parts to the promise. There's two blessings to this promise. And see if you can pick them up as I read them. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" And now, some of us have heard those verses over and over again, and have heard that promise that's been given to Abraham over and over and over again. Have we ever picked up the two parts of the blessing? Because there's a blessing of land. God says, "Go to the land that I will show you." And there's also the blessing of people. I will make of you a great nation. And we see here, if we go back to Ezra, we see that promise being renewed in this genealogy of all things. In verse 3, we see the sons of, the sons of, the sons of, all the way down through, verse 30-something. And we see an emphasis of the sons of a family name. That the author of Ezra is pointing out that the people are the blessing. These people that are coming back to see this promise, to pursue this promise. But it's not just of people of a family lineage, but it's also the people of the land. If we look at verse 21, there's a slight transition that we might not pick up, but it's the sons of Bethlehem, the men of Netophath, the men of Anathoth. These are all places or regions or areas in the land of Israel. And so there's this renewal, or there's revitalization of a previous promise that they're holding on to, a tie back to family lineage of people and a tie back to land. The promise is being renewed, and it's tied to land and people. But we have to before we move on, we have to consider as well, this blessing that's been given to the nation of Israel was not intended to be for themselves. It's intended to be for other people. They're to be a light to other nations. Back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, God says, I'm going to do this so you can be a blessing to others. Interesting. So there's a re-emphasizing of a previous promise that was meant to be passed along to other people. But we also see a revitalizing of worship. There's two types of worship. There's two types of offerings in the sacrificial system of Israel. Excuse me. One is a vow offering. And a vow offering was made by someone who didn't have the resources or who didn't have the means to provide an offering at that time. And so they would make this vow to God with full intent of fulfilling that vow. Kind of in our culture, we give a vow and we don't follow through with that vow. It's an empty promise that's given. But this vow that they're talking about here is a vow that was intended of an offering that was to be given. They didn't have the resources, but at some point they would come back and fulfill that vow, that sacrifice that they were making to God. We looked at Hannah back in 1 Samuel. She promised God that if you give me a son, I will bring him to the temple, and he will be a servant of yours for his life. And we see a prominent figure being Samuel that came out of this promise, this vow that was made by Hannah. And so that's the first type of vow or offering. The other one is a free will offering. And this is an unplanned, spontaneous gift that is given by an individual, by a person. And we see this in Exodus chapter 35. If you go back and read through Exodus 35, you'll see that Moses is standing before the nation of Israel, and they're about to build the tabernacle. And Moses gives this, this speech about the tabernacle and the dwelling place of God. And the response of the people is that they brought gold, they brought silver, they brought threads, they brought all of the stuff that was needed to build the tabernacle. And it was done as a free will offering. That it wasn't pre-planned, but it was as people decided to give freely. And the interesting thing that we see here is in Ezra chapter 2 is this whole thing happening over again. In verse 68, some of the heads of the families, when they came to the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, made free will offerings for the house and for the house of God to be erected there, for the temple to be erected. It says they gave gold and silver and threads and all this stuff. But there's a revitalization of worship that's taking place. There's this free will offering that's been given so that worship can take place again. And the thing about this is, revitalization wore off. I don't mean to be a spoiler alert. We're not going to talk about all of that today, but we'll see as we go through the first 6 chapters of Ezra that revitalization wore off, that the leadership lost their focus. They excluded those who were seeking the blessing. They, the worship was no longer a priority. And as hard as we try, we get into that same thing. we lose our focus. We lose this act of worship that we have. We exclude others from seeking that blessing. But there's one person that has done this perfectly. That's Jesus. And if we're not pursuing Jesus, if we don't have Jesus in our life, then we're going to have a difficult time seeing revitalization in our life. So it's an act that we come to him and say, Jesus, I want you to be part of my life. He's the one that turns things around. You know, we have to ask ourselves, what about you? What about us as a church? As we kind of talk through this and look at this text, what is there in this genealogy for us? Because we're not in the genealogy, but is there something for us that we can grab a hold of as individuals, as a church, as we walk away from this text today? I believe there are. I think there's a couple of things. One is that revitalization doesn't happen by accident. It's not easy. I think may have shared with you before my landscaping experiences out in Iowa. We lived there for 6 to 6.5 years, and we moved into a home and found out that the previous owner really didn't know how to do landscaping. Their idea of revitalization for landscaping was bring in a bunch of dirt and just put it over top of a bunch of landscaping rock, or bury some concrete in the broken up concrete in the backyard, and that's their idea of revitalization for their landscaping, and it didn't work out very well. I spent 5 of those 6.5 years revitalizing the landscaping, and finally got it to a place where things were looking really good in the yard. And so the next owner is really, I hope, appreciating the landscaping and the work that I did 5 out of those 6.5 years to revitalize that landscape. But it was hard work. And the easy thing to do is to just bring in a bunch of dirt and cover it all over. And a lot of times when it comes to revitalization in our life and in our church, we look for that very thing. We look for the quick fix. We look for what is called the silver bullet. That one thing, that if we had this one thing, then revitalization would happen. Man, things would really take off in our life, or things would really take off in our church. You know, some of those things for the church that are considered to be the silver bullet is, hey, if we just had the right pastor. If we just had a young pastor that could come in here and bring in people would just flock to him. Sorry, guys. You know, I'm the pastor here at Pleasant Hill. Some of you know me. Some of you might not know me. I'm not the silver bullet. I will be the first person to admit that I am not the silver bullet for seeing revitalization, for seeing great things happen here at Pleasant Hill. It's not going to start with me. So if you're looking for that, sorry, it's not me. Money. If we just had enough money, that we could just imagine what we could do with money. If we had enough money, then we could do a whole bunch of stuff. We can have buildings, we can have programs, we can do this, we can help our community, and that'll bring revitalization. Location. If we just had the right location or the right facility, then we can see revitalization happen. If we just played the right music, then we'd see revitalization happening. You know, all of these things we look at and we say, hey, if we could just do that, then people would flock to us. We could see some great things happening. If we're looking for a silver bullet to bring about revitalization, we're looking for the wrong thing. You know, the thing is that just as the leaders came back from Babylon to Jerusalem and Judah, and they were seeking after God, that's what it takes. Just as a group of people came back intentionally seeking this promise, that's what it takes. It takes the leaders and a group of people who are intentionally pursuing God in a tangible, real way and are willing to put in the hard work. That's what we can do. Revitalization is also meant to be shared with others. You know, there's a group of people, I mentioned them at the beginning. In verse 59, it says, the following were those who came up from these different regions. And though they could not prove their father's house of their descent, whether they belonged to Israel, they still came back. And what they were looking for is they were looking for hope. There were these people that were coming back, or maybe some people say they lived there and came back as part of the revitalization, but they were looking for this hope that they could tie in some way back to the promise of Abraham. People around us are looking for hope. There are people in our neighborhoods, there are people in our workplace, there are people in our families that are looking for hope. But here's the hard work of revitalization. The hard work of revitalization is not necessarily receiving the hope or having the hope. The hard work of revitalization is passing that hope along to someone that desires hope, to someone that we don't know. That's the hard work of revitalization. Oftentimes we tend to hold on to that hope and think that the hope is only for us. But just as that promise that was given to Abraham, God says, Abraham, I'm going to bless you so that you can turn around and pass that blessing along to other people. But we often think of hope as something that we desire, which, yes, we do desire hope. We want to hold on to that hope. But it's not meant for us to hold on to. It's meant for us to pass it along. And oftentimes it's meant to be passed along to people that we don't know, to people that need it. We may very well need to reach outside of the people that we currently know and start looking not with blinders on, but opening up our eyes to see who are the people that are around us that we can share that hope with. Revitalization is meant to be shared with others. And then thirdly, revitalization is freely pursued. It can't be forced upon anyone. In the New Testament, our bodies are talked about as temples. Our bodies are a temple for God. We're a dwelling place of God. That's what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. That as a follower of Jesus, our bodies are meant to be a place where God can dwell. And we've talked about in Exodus chapter 35 about how this free will offering was given so that the tabernacle can be built. Remember Moses making that appeal. And here in Ezra, there is a free will offering that's given by some of the families when they come into the nation or come into the countryside, into Jerusalem. They say, we are going to give a free will offering so that the temple can be built. Paul, he makes a third appeal for our temple, for our bodies. When in Romans chapter 12, he makes an appeal to the Roman Christians and to us. He says, I beg you, I beseech you to make your bodies a living sacrifice. And why is it that he's making this appeal? In chapter 12, almost all the way through the book of Romans, because chapters 1 through 11, he's explaining our current condition and where we were and where it is that God came into the picture and how it is that God pursued us and God that loved us. And he goes through the first 11 chapters talking about where we've come from and where we're going and what Jesus has done for us. And then when he gets to all of this, he says, when you understand, or as you begin to understand chapters 1 through 11, you will make your life a living sacrifice. It's not money, it's not resources, but it's a life that's given to him. What would happen if this week we prayed for one opportunity? We prayed for one opportunity this week to connect with a person that we don't know. That's scary, I know. It's really scary. But what if we prayed, God, give me one person that I have never met before, that I can share hope with, that I can encourage them, that I can pray for them, that I can share hope with them this week? What would happen if we did that as a church? That we sought out the hope of someone else, to pass on that hope to someone else that we don't know. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning And God, we know that you have given us a great gift in Jesus. And we can see this revitalization in our life. But we know there's others that desire the same hope in their life. And may we pursue them. May we see revitalization taking place here at Pleasant Hill, individually in our lives and collectively as a church. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.